Burnside QC is a great friend of Amnesty and an inspiration to many. He joined the bar in 1976 and took silk in '89 and is recognised for his legal advocacy and community work. He has acted in many high-profile cases, including for Rose Porteous in actions against Gina Rinehart, for the Maritime Union in their waterfront dispute against Patrick Stevedores, and for Bruce Trevorrow, a member of the Stolen Generation, against the state of South Australia. Like me, Julian is extremely concerned about Australia's treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. He frequently provides pro bono legal assistance in supporting asylum claims and challenging government decisions. He appeared pro bono as Counsel for Liberty Victoria to act for the people on board the Tampa. He also acted pro bono to represent asylum seekers who escaped from the Woomera Immigration Detention Centre. He also encourages others to donate their time to supporting asylum seekers, and together with his wife, Kate Durham, set up Spare Rooms for Refugees, an initiative designed to foster practical support for asylum seekers. In 2004, Julian was elected a living national treasure, and in 2009, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia. Julian is living proof that every individual can make a difference. In tonight's commemorative address, Lest We Forget, Julian will examine Australia's selective national memory on the topic of asylum seekers and human rights. Please join me in welcoming Julian Burnside.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to say that Claire has covered quite a bit of the territory I was going to, so I could cross a few things off. There's a sort of paradox at the heart of my chosen topic tonight, because as any wordsmiths in the audience will remember, amnesty comes from the Greek meaning forgetting. It has the same root as amnesia. It also means oblivion. And when applied in the usual context, amnesty means that a government decides that it will forget or overlook the offences of a particular person or group. So it's a curious thing on the 50th anniversary of Amnesty International to be talking about the subject of forgetting, but that is my chosen topic. And maybe it's appropriate that there is a paradox in it, because my central thesis is that there is a paradox at the heart of Australian society on this very subject of forgetting. Lest we forget is one of those resonant phrases that we've all known from childhood. We all think it or say it on the 11th of November each year and on Anzac Day. And certainly this year, the 11th of the 11th, 2011, at 11 a.m, many of us, I'm sure, thought of that precise expression. And yet, although we remember it as one of the sort of core phrases that we associate with being Australian, forgetting lies at the heart of this country. We have constructed for ourselves a myth about ourselves which cannot survive unless we forget a few inconvenient facts about our country and its circumstances. We forget, for example, that although boat people are now commonly referred to as illegals, that they haven't broken the law by coming here. It's one of the most potent bits of propaganda invented by the Howard government, that they tagged boat people as illegals so as to make it seem respectable to lock them up indefinitely, because after all, criminals get locked up all the time. That's the way the justice system worked. It would have been rather less palatable for the Australian public if they had realised that the so-called illegals haven't broken any law at all, but rather are giving effect to a right which is enshrined in many international human rights instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, incidentally, Australia helped to frame. We were amongst the leading nations in the construction of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the years immediately following the Second World War, and I think it's generally accepted that in that process, Australia punched above its weight. And as an interesting historical sidelight, as many of you know, it was an Australian, Doc Evatt, who presided over the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed into force. We also forget, it seems, that the very first boat people to come to Australia on the 26th of January 1788 were illegals, in the sense that more than half of them were convicted criminals who'd been exported from their own country because of their breach of the law. And along with them were soldiers to guard them and administrators who, following instructions from London, stole the land from the original inhabitants. Now, stealing the land is a convenient shorthand, but I suppose if one wants to look for marks of ownership, if possession is 9 points of the law, then the Aborigines had 30,000 years of law to back their claim to be the owners of this land, and it took until 1992 for us to recognise as a country that in fact they had owned the land. Until then, of course, the doctrine of terra nullius had said that the land was empty. And you'll all, of course, remember, since this is a day of remembering rather than forgetting, you will all remember that it was not until 1967 that Aborigines were counted in the census. Until that time, they'd been treated as part of the fauna of the country. Not only did the original settlers take the land from the Aborigines, they also subsequently took their children. And I'm very grateful that Claire mentioned the case of Bruce Trevorrow, because Bruce Trevorrow is a landmark case decided in this city in, I think, 2007. It was a case in which my junior counsel was Claire O'Connor from Adelaide, and Martin Hinton, who's here, knows it well enough because he appeared in the appeal. Bruce was born in 1956 at 1 Mile Camp, Meningie, 1 mile outside Meningie. I've been to Meningie, it's not a big place, and in 1956 it must have been quite a small place. 1 Mile Camp was a little settlement of humpies made out of flattened out oil drums and discarded sacking. And it was 1 mile outside Meningie because in those days in South Australia it was illegal for Aborigines to live closer than 1 mile to a place of white settlement unless they had a permit. When Bruce was 13 months old, Christmas Day 1957, he got very sick, and he was taken from Meningie up to Adelaide by some people in Meningie who had a car, and he was admitted to the Children's Hospital. And the admission notes, which still survive, show that Bruce was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, and after a week of appropriate treatment his gastro resolved, and a week later he was given away to a white family who lived in suburban Adelaide. They had a daughter who was 16 years old at the time, and she remembered the event very well because her mother had always wanted a second daughter. And they'd seen an ad in the paper offering Aboriginal babies. And so one Sunday, instead of going off looking at display houses, they went to the hospital to choose an Aboriginal baby. And apparently they saw a lineup of little babies, and they saw a cute curly-headed little girl at one end and said, "We'll take her," and she was handed over to them. They took her home, and when they got her home and changed her nappy, they discovered she was a boy. That was how casually a human being could be trafficked in Adelaide in January of 1958. Now, when Bruce's mum, down at 1 Mile Camp Meningie, managed to find a pen and paper and stamp an envelope and an address, she wrote to the department asking how Bruce was going and when he was coming home. And they wrote back a letter which still survives in the State Archives saying that he was doing quite well, but the doctor said he wasn't well enough to come home yet. This was 3 months after they'd given him away and had simply taken no further interest in him. There was no evidence to support the idea that any doctor had said that he was not well enough to be returned home. Bruce dropped out of sight for the next couple of years, but he was admitted to the Adelaide Children's Hospital again when he was, I think, 2.5 or 3 years old, because he was tearing his own hair out. And by the time he was 8 or 9, he began having behavioural difficulties. Up until that point, his mother had told him, his foster mother, I should say, had told him that he was her natural child, and explained his darker complexion by reference to the fact that she had relatives in Wales. I don't imagine an 8-year-old thinks these things through, but when his behaviour became a bit difficult, his foster mother told him that in fact he was not her natural child, that he was Aboriginal, and that if he didn't behave better, she'd send him back. His behaviour improved briefly, but then got worse again, and he was taken to the recently formed Child Guidance Clinic, and the notes from that clinic still survive, and they show that each time he was seen, he was assessed as having no real sense of who he was or where he belonged. The foster mother was warned that telling him that he'd be sent away was very damaging to him, but apparently it kept up. When Bruce was 10 years old, he met his natural mother for the very first time, and the meeting was interesting, and it was arranged through the welfare people that the following Easter, I think it was, he would go down to Port Lincoln, where the mother and his siblings were then living. His father had died 6 months before. He never met his father. When the welfare people came to send him off to Port Lincoln, Victor Harbour perhaps, Victor Harbour I think, they put him on the bus and sent him off, and when the bus had gone, the foster mother said to the welfare people that she didn't want him back, he was too much trouble. And so they posted his toys and his books and things after him. That was the way Bruce was returned to his natural family. All the while all of these events happened, the department had in its records 2 written opinions from 2 Crown solicitors of the state of South Australia saying that the department had no legal power to remove Aboriginal children from their parents. But correspondence in their files showed that they did it whenever they got the chance. Bruce's 2 brothers were never taken from their parents because they had the good fortune not to be admitted to hospital. Now, Bruce's story is just one of many thousands, but an interesting single illustration of the devastating effect of removing children from their parents. And it is true to say that Bruce was seriously damaged by the fact of having been removed from his parents. It's interesting to stand back. We tend to forget. We tend not to relate ourselves to the reality of what went on in those years and went on until the 1960s. We tend not to remember or to think what it must be like to be removed from your parents for no particular reason. Just imagine the reaction in white society if it turned out that a hospital in a poor part of town was giving away children from a poor part of town to parents from a rich part of town on the footing that they would probably have a better upbringing if they were brought up by rich parents. That was the thinking which informed at least one strand of the policy of removing Aboriginal children from their parents. It seems to us now quite barbaric. And yet there was virtually no social response to the fact of Bruce winning his case on the facts that I've just outlined. There seemed to be no sense of real concern in the community that these things had happened and had caused profound damage to generations of Aboriginal children who in their turn grew up to be dysfunctional adults, some of them at least, and in turn passed on the damage to their children. Interestingly, the decision in Bruce's case was handed down, I think, on the 1st of August 2007. Shortly afterwards, Kevin Rudd was elected Prime Minister, and he announced that at the first sitting of the new Parliament, he would apologise to the victims of the stolen generations. Bruce's brothers, Tom and George, leaders of the Ngarrindjeri community, were invited to go to Canberra for Sorry Day, but the officials forgot to invite Bruce. One of the most remarkable acts of forgetting imaginable in the circumstances. They got a reminder and sent a late notice to him. We forget also, in all of these things, we forget the line in the second verse of the national anthem, a line which tells a plain truth that for those who come across the seas we've boundless plains to spare, to share. Well, both. Thank you. I wonder how that line must seem to those who are locked up on Christmas Island or in the detention centres in the far-flung, remote northern parts of this country. It must seem to them to shine a light on the frontier that separates delusion from hypocrisy. How different it is. We do forget how different it is these days from the days when Malcolm Fraser and Ian McPhee brought in nearly 85,000 Vietnamese boat people with no discernible social unrest at all. They did it with bipartisan support from Gough Whitlam, albeit it was not easy to bring Gough across the line, according to Malcolm, but eventually it was, and we all know the line that he used initially, but eventually Gough was persuaded that it should be done on a bipartisan basis. And so what happened was that there was genuine regional cooperation. There was a genuine solution based in Malaysia, because in order to spare the incredible dangers of the voyage in the tiny unseaworthy boats in which Vietnamese were embarking, they were processed in Malaysia, but the key to it was that the participating countries, which included Australia, the United States, Canada, I think, the United Kingdom and New Zealand, all guaranteed swift resettlement for everyone who was assessed as a refugee. Of course, the thing about the Malaysian solution recently, it's not about processing, it's about resettlement. As long as resettlement is guaranteed as an immediate result of being accepted as a refugee, it probably doesn't matter where the processing takes place, as long as it's fair. We forget too the devastation that we helped wreak on Vietnam. We forget the tons of Agent Orange which was sprayed over their country, which devastated their landscape and disfigured their people. We forget why it is that people are desperate enough to flee the land of their birth. Something that was perfectly illustrated by the Vietnamese boat people. We forget how successfully the Vietnamese boat people have been absorbed into the Australian community and how much they are now contributing to the Australian community. We forget that it all happened easily and humanely because of the common sense and decency of the two major parties back then. Maybe we've forgotten what it's like to have two major political parties informed by any form of decency. Maybe we've forgotten what it's like to have two major parties that are different. We also forget, you know, I don't know how many people have been to the Museum of the Remnants of the American War in Saigon. It's a chilling place. It's a very sober display of all sorts of things left over from what we call the Vietnam War and what they call the American War. It includes a couple of things that I wouldn't have guessed at. One is photographs by the dozen of people damaged by Agent Orange. We're all aware that Agent Orange was being used in Vietnam, but I think the press coverage, at least in Australia, didn't give any sense of the scale of the devastation which it worked. The tens of thousands of people who were appallingly disfigured by Agent Orange and the damage which it did to the countryside. And the other thing which I had not expected was a photograph which I dimly remembered from the time, a photograph of an American GI holding in his hand the skull and flayed skin of a dead Vietnamese, and judging by the size, probably a dead Vietnamese child, and the GI is smiling as if he's done something good. We forget how brutal that war was, and perhaps we forget how brutal all wars are. We forget why it is that people flee the land of their birth. You know, in recent times, one of the major groups of arrivals in Australia seeking asylum have been Hazaras from Afghanistan. Now, the Hazaras arrived in Afghanistan 700 or 800 years ago, and you will remember that in February of 2001, the Taliban demolished the great Bamiyan Buddhas, two enormous Buddhas hewn into the cliff face by Hazaras 600 or 700 years ago. Because when they arrived in Afghanistan, they were Buddhist. They look distinctly different because they're distinctly Asian in their appearance. thought to be the descendants of Genghis Khan. They have been the target of the hatred of the Pashtun majority for at least the last couple of 100 years, and especially under the Taliban. The Taliban, who are all Pashtun, of course, are Sunni Muslim. The Hazaras have converted to Islam, but they're Shia Muslim. And so we have the unfortunate spectacle of a religious minority who are hated by the religious majority, who look physically different, and if it adds some historical symmetry, they're also circumcised. It is very easy to detect a Hazara male, at least. Now, the Taliban have been particularly brutal. They're engaged in ethnic cleansing of the Hazara. We all have heard of examples of it, I'm sure, but in recent months, we know of a case where a bus was pulled over by the Taliban. All of the Hazaras on the bus were ordered out onto the road, and they were then shot. In another instance, a number of Hazara men who were travelling from one place to another in a minivan were intercepted, they were taken out, they were beheaded, and their heads were left beside their bodies on the road. In a friend of mine, a kid in Melbourne, who's, I think he's 16 or 17 years old, is being fostered by a friend of ours. He was devastated recently because a suicide bomber at the school which he used to attend until a year ago was a suicide bomber, blew himself up and killed about 20 people, 20 children at that school. And then, at the funeral for those children, another suicide bomber killed many of the grieving relatives. One Hazara man, or young man, who was sent back to Afghanistan in early 2002, when he was on Nauru, and the Howard government insisted that it was safe to return Hazaras to Afghanistan because, after all, the Taliban had been defeated. I think he spoke too soon. This young man was sent back to Afghanistan forcibly from Nauru, and instead of escaping back across the border into Pakistan, he went back to his village, and there the Taliban hunted him out, and they dragged him out of his house in front of the rest of the villagers, threw him down the well and dropped a hand grenade after him. Now, these are things that cause Hazaras to have a fear of persecution on religious grounds. And not surprising. They get here, and yet we somehow forget that that's the sort of thing that makes them flee. We manage to ignore completely the incredible dangers from which they run. We also tend to forget the fact that most people would prefer to live in their homeland because that's the place to which they feel the greatest attraction. And I remember doing a case for a young woman who was in Curtin, who'd converted to Christianity in Curtin. She'd been interested in Christianity for a while because her grandmother was an Armenian Christian. Anyway, whilst in Curtin, she converted to Christianity and she began preaching against Islam. And various people in the camp would come along and listen to her talks. And one of them, let's call him Hassan for want of another name, would come along and take notes. And then one day in August, I think of 2002 or 3, Hassan left the camp, left the country, and voluntarily returned to Iran. Now, the penalty, and 2 weeks later, this young woman got a message from Iran that she was in deep trouble because Hassan was a Basiji informer, had told the authorities in Iran that she was preaching against Islam, and the penalty for that is death by stoning, if you're a woman. I've seen a video of someone being stoned to death, and I tell you, it is truly frightful. I won't go into the details of the RRT case, but the RRT member who heard the case decided that Hassan had been invented, that he had been invented to fortify her story, that she hadn't been informed on, therefore she wasn't at that risk, and so he rejected her claim for protection. When the matter went to court, the department's files for Hassan were subpoenaed, and it turned out that he did exist, he had been in the camp, he had left on the very day that all the witnesses had said, and he'd gone back to Iran voluntarily, as all the witnesses had said. Notwithstanding the fact that the decision was plainly wrong, the government came along and argued that being wrong didn't matter, and that he could be returned anyway, because it is within the jurisdictional reach of the RRT to make mistakes of fact. And let me tell you, that theory still operates today. Getting the facts plainly, blindly wrong does not mean that you get up on appeal. Fortunately, the court accepted the argument that because the RRT member had failed to take the simplest possible inquiry on a life and death question, namely the existence of Hassan, he could have just walked up the corridor and asked the department to show him the records. Because he had failed to make that simple inquiry, that was evidence of bad faith, and bad faith vitiates a decision even if plain errors of fact do not. As a result, she got a second go-round, another hearing in the RRT with a different member, all the same evidence, and eventually, she was accepted as a refugee. I had never met her up till this time, but about 18 months later, I bumped into her in Sydney. She came up to me at a function, and my wife and I took her out to dinner with her then boyfriend, and it was extraordinary to learn that the one thing she wanted more than anything else was to be able to go back to Iran and live there. She just didn't want to go back and be stoned to death. We really do forget that people's attraction, people's connection to their homeland is incredibly powerful, and perhaps we can't afford to remember it because otherwise we might treat Aborigines differently. There's an interesting little bit of the Malaysian solution that we've forgotten. I've read the document, the Malaysian arrangement, which is specifically not in agreement, specifically not enforceable, but amongst the terms that Australia negotiated with Malaysia was this. The people who would be sent back were referred to as transferees, and the transferees would be detained initially by Malaysia on their arrival for initial health and security checks. But then, after a maximum of 45 days, they would be released into the community with work rights. Now, I thought that was a pretty good idea. And I wondered why it is that the government couldn't remember, in its treatment of people who arrive here seeking asylum, why they couldn't remember that that was a term that they thought was good enough to impose on Malaysia. And, in fact, I wonder if they'd forgotten what the problem was to which Malaysia was said to be the solution. Because when you think about it, the apparent problem was the overcrowding in detention centres. Now, given that we lock people up indefinitely, which may mean that they're in detention for 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years, the fact that we lock them up indefinitely naturally means that there will be a crowding problem if there's a sudden spike in arrival rates. And there had been a sudden spike in arrival rate. If, of course, we had decided that all we needed to do was hold them for an initial health and security assessment and then release them into the community with work rights, there'd be no overcrowding at all. I wonder which brilliant mind in the department seems to have overlooked the possibility that we might do what we wanted Malaysia to do, and that that might be a solution to the problem that was vastly cheaper and vastly more humane. The political rhetoric about this recently has been fascinating. The focus has shifted away from demonising refugees to demonising people smugglers. And it seemed to be working quite well for both sides of politics to demonise the people smugglers because, after all, people drown, people smugglers seem to be unscrupulous, and so naturally they're an easy target. They're a much easier target than the refugees, who some members of the community have begun to recognise are actually human beings. And with that comes a startling insight that perhaps we should treat them better. And so instead we attack the people smugglers. And it's an interesting thing about people smugglers. We tend to assume that all people smugglers are equally dreadful, vile, awful people, all at the bottom of the barrel, down there with lawyers and politicians, maybe even lower. And this overlooks a few important things. It involves forgetting completely one key fact about people smugglers. No matter how unscrupulous, exploitive or mercenary they may be, they are the last line of escape. And it's no kindness to cut off a person's last line of escape. But that is what Australia planned to do by trying to smash the people smugglers' business model, as the MBA wits decided to describe the activity. The other thing that we tend to forget is that not all people smugglers are equally bad. I'm sure the Labor Party had forgotten, at least temporarily, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the moral hero of Kevin Rudd, was a people smuggler. We seem to have forgotten that Oskar Schindler, who we seem to like rather in the book and the film, Oskar Schindler was a people smuggler, and much more mercenary and less scrupulous than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We forget almost completely Gustav Schroeder. Gustav Schroeder was the master of the MS St. Louis that embarked from Hamburg in May of 1939 with 900 Jews on board, some of them rich, by the way. Being rich does not mean that you aren't a refugee. It really annoys me when you hear people chattering about, oh, well, if they can afford to pay a people smuggler, they're obviously not genuine refugees. Well, actually, I think it works the other way, because if you're rich and you risk your life in a leaky boat to get to another country, that suggests you're pretty serious about leaving. Why would you do that if you weren't being persecuted? Gustav Schroeder took his cargo of 900 Jews all around the world. He pulled every trick in the book. He did whatever he could to try and land them somewhere in safety. He did it for the money. He was a people smuggler, no doubt about it. He ended up in Cuba, but he couldn't persuade the Cuban government to take them ashore except at extortionate prices which no one could afford. They were fended off the Florida coast by American guns and ended up having to go back to Europe, where he disembarked them in Antwerp, and when the Low Countries were overrun by the Nazis, more than half of those people were killed in concentration camps. What Gustav Schroeder did was nothing short of heroic. It was seen so then, it must be seen so now, but he was a people smuggler. I wonder what that does for the theory of the two major parties about the moral qualities of people smugglers. And if it matters, let's not forget that in The Sound of Music, the Von Trapp family were refugees and the nuns were people smugglers. And I would be interested to hear Tony Abbott criticise the nuns in The Sound of Music. Another thing we've forgotten, in the last couple of decades at least, is that we used to have political parties that had identifiable philosophies, that had roots from which they sprang, which informed their policy settings on most issues. But they had a philosophy, they had a set of principles, different principles in the two camps, different philosophies in the two camps. We knew that the Labour Party came from the union movement and reflected the values and aspirations of working people. We knew that the Liberal Party came from the forgotten people, the small business people, that's a distant echo, isn't it? To think that it was for small business and small forgotten people. You could tell in most issues, back then, you could tell pretty much what the policies would be in each of the major parties because of where they came from, because of their defining philosophies. But no longer is that so. Nowadays, both of them form their policies by reference to news polls and focus groups. And it's sometimes hard to tell, without looking, which party is the author of which policy, because there is so little to distinguish between them. Now, it's all very well that democracy is supposed to be the rule of the majority. Focus groups, in my opinion, do not give you the rule of the majority at all. What they do is they give you a readout of attitudes of some people in key marginal electorates, and that's all. That's not the majority of people in Australia. That's a tiny fragment of the Australian population. And some of them have some quite interesting views. I have this is an interesting example of some of the challenging mail that I receive. It's distinguished by a couple of things. The first is that it's recent. I used to get torrents of hate mail in the early years, from 2001 to about 2005. Whenever I said anything public about this issue, I'd get a torrent of hate mail, and very vicious it was. I also used to get, it was mostly by email, I used to get it in written form as well, but typically then, if I received a hate mail by physical means, it tended not to have a name and address. But this one is distinguished because this has a name and address, and I actually answered it today. I'll give you some edited extracts from this. This is a genuine letter. I'm sorry to say it comes from Whyalla, but there you go. Blah, 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 blah. I've heard yourself and others on the left and the Greens. The do-gooder attitude makes me sick. No passport, no entry. There's a brilliant piece of logical jumping here. Get this. No passport, no entry, as with paperwork, as with Aborigines. Most of the problems they have, drinking, etc., to me, the only good Aborigine is a dead one. Now, the no passport, no entry, as with Aborigines, I really don't get that. Clearly, he did not major in history. Blah, blah, blah. Nothing has changed in the last 40 years or so, and it won't, because that's how Aborigines are, hopeless losers. If I was Prime Minister, I have a plan that would fix it permanently. There's a frightening observation, and this person probably has a disproportionately loud voice in the formation of policy. Blah, 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 blah. I would turn all refugee boats around. If they come back 2 or 3 times, they'd be sunk and the people left to drown. I have no problem with this. You would find if 7 or 8 boats sinking and people left to drown, the problem would stop overnight. This do-gooder left-wing idea, thanks to people like yourself, the ABC and Greens, are part of the problem, not the answer. They can get support from people like yourself, the churches and Labor, and the ABC through people like the pathetic Philip Adams and bureaucrats like John Menadue and Robert Mann, left-wing lecturer, and other like David Marr, journalist, and others, blah, blah, blah. And when they get here, they are given what I call 5-star luxury in detention centres. I agree with John Howard that we, Australia, says who can stay here and those who cannot. I would tell the UNHCR to go to hell and tear up the refugee agreement with the United Nations and human rights. Blah, blah, blah. I'm sick of all this crap from people like yourself pandering to the asylum seekers, giving them the red carpet treatment. I don't care about the discrimination side of things. I'm a proud racist and discriminator. Blah, blah, blah. I look forward to your reply shortly, but I won't hold my breath. I have a policy of answering all hate mail, and I'm waiting to hear his response to my reply. It is tragic to think that the policies of both major parties reflect, at least in some respects, the sort of views that you see in letters like that. The sort of views which are, on any analysis, marginal, but they just happen to be visible in electorates that are important to whichever party is going to win government. It seems to me that there are times and issues when majority rule begins to look rather uncomfortably like mob rule, and we seem to have slipped into the Jim Hacker mould of leadership, which is where he famously said, "I am their leader, I must follow them." On moral questions, we need political leaders who will lead us towards something decent. We forget too what a fragile hold we have on human rights in this country. By and large, of course, human rights are fairly well respected in Australia, and when you compare us with some countries that easily spring to mind, you would have to say that on any scale we are very lucky. But we are rich and peaceful and remarkably homogeneous as a nation, and the plain fact is we can do a whole lot better. We do forget the fragility with which human rights maintain a foothold here. Think of on the one hand, the Communist Party case in the High Court, in which the attempt of the Liberal government to outlaw the Communist Party failed, and then an attempt to change the Constitution so as to make it constitutionally possible to ban the Communist Party. That failed. That was a triumph for human rights. Both the decision of the court and the decision of the people in the referendum was a triumph for human rights. Compare that with the case of Ahmed Al-Khatib, who came here seeking asylum, and because the Migration Act says that if you're a non-citizen without a visa, you must be detained and remain in detention until you get a visa or until you're removed from the country. Now, he was refused a visa, and instead of prolonging his stay in detention, he didn't appeal the result. He asked to be removed, but he couldn't be removed because he's stateless. And so here was an impasse. Only 2 ways out of detention: visa or removal. Visa refused, removal not possible. What to do? Although Al-Khatib had not committed any offence, although he was not regarded as a risk to the country, the Howard government argued all the way to the High Court that he could remain in detention for the rest of his life. And by a majority of 4-3, in August of 2004, the High Court held that that's what the Migration Act means, and with that meaning it's constitutionally valid. Any country which allows a decision like that to be made by its ultimate court of appeal has a human rights problem. There is, on the other hand, the case of Bruce Trevorrow, a striking, outstanding success for this city, this state. I know the state didn't applaud the result, but it's still, in a symbolic way, a truly important win. It's the only stolen generation case in the history of this country where the plaintiff has succeeded and received very substantial damages. That's a great thing for human rights. On the other hand, there's a case of Sagar in the federal court earlier this year. Sagar and Faisal were two Iraqi men who'd been caught up in the Pacific solution. They'd been taken across to Nauru. They'd been assessed as refugees, but they remained on Nauru because they'd been refused visas. They'd been refused visas because ASIO had adversely assessed them. It was a rather curious thing because ASIO didn't even speak to them until they'd been on Nauru for about 4 years. When Faisal later had a mental breakdown on Nauru, he was medically evacuated to Brisbane. And in Brisbane, whilst he was in a mental hospital, ASIO reassessed him as not a security risk. I don't know whether going mad makes you safer, but that's how it was. Anyway, we brought a case in the federal court challenging the decision to adversely assess. And at the risk of oversimplifying, their evidence, given by video link, their evidence was, we've never done anything at all, ever in our lives, that could bring us within the reach of any of the provisions that relate to security. They were not challenged on that. They were not cross-examined on that. And ASIO put forward nothing to suggest the contrary. ASIO's argument in the federal court was, because you, the judge, do not know what ASIO took into account in deciding to adversely assess, you can't set aside that decision. And the judge agreed. Now, for those two men, it didn't matter too much. Faisal had been reassessed as not a risk and he now has permanent residency in Australia. Sagar had been admitted into Sweden, where after a 1-hour interview with the security people, he was given permanent residency, regarded as not a risk. The problem, however, is very real for a number of people presently being held in detention centres in the northern part of Australia and in Christmas Island, because there are a number of people, typically Tamils from Sri Lanka, who have been assessed as refugees and are being refused visas because of adverse security assessments by ASIO. ASIO refused to tell them why they've been adversely assessed. They're not allowed to know any of the facts which were taken into account. If Sagar's case is any guide, they will not get any more information about their circumstances if they go to court. They're stuck in Mr. Al-Khatib's problem. They can't be removed because they're refugees, and to send them back to their country of origin would breach the central obligation under the Refugees Convention, which is you do not send a refugee back to a place of persecution. But they're not let into the country either because ASIO has adversely assessed. They face the prospect of being jailed forever merely because ASIO has formed a view about them, and they're not even allowed to know why. They're not charged with anything. They're not given a hint of what they've done wrong, or whether they had bad thoughts, or whether they cried out in their sleep. They're not allowed to know anything at all, but they face the prospect of life in prison because of the way our court system refuses to force ASIO to be called to account. It seems to me to be a very, very major problem in human rights in this country. We had the Brennan Inquiry a couple of years ago. The Brennan Inquiry, which recommended overwhelmingly that Australia should have a Human Rights Act at federal level. And then, without any explanation, peremptorily, Kevin Rudd announced, shortly after Tony Abbott took over leadership of the opposition, I think, Kevin Rudd announced unilaterally we would not have a Human Rights Act for Australia. All the more disappointing for the fact that the Labor Party, as I understand it, has a Human Rights Act as part of its policy platform. 3 or 4 times in the last 3 decades, they've made a run at bringing in a Human Rights Act. and each time they've pulled back from the brink. Any country in the 21st century, any rich, prosperous, peaceful Western country in the 21st century, which not only does not have a Human Rights Act, but decide positively not to have one, frankly, has forgotten the lessons of history. And that seems to me to be a problem in Australia. We have forgotten the truth about our origins. We've forgotten our good fortune. We've forgotten our blindness and selfishness over the past 2 centuries. And in place of the memories, we have constructed a national myth about being generous and welcoming and warm and friendly and believing the idea of a fair go for everyone. It's vanity which fills the emptiness where the truth has been forgotten. But maybe I'm too pessimistic. Maybe our national myths are more or less true. I like to think that they are. Maybe the problem is that the politicians who are willing to play football with people like asylum seekers and any other minority group who don't command anything in the way of votes, maybe it's the politicians who've forgotten what our national character really is. And if that's right, well, then it's important that we all make sure that they remember what Australia is about, because every day, they are degrading our national character and bringing down our international reputation. And we need to remind them lest we forget. Thank you.